Begin?
As you wish.
Begin my spiel?
As you wish.
I'm sitting comfortably.
Yeah.
I'll begin my spiel then. My spiel goes like this. The economic calculation argument was far older than Mises, but Mises made it his own. The idea of human capital can be found in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, not just once, but many times. Smith is quite preoccupied with human capital. But Gary Becker has made it his own just recently, since the war. Now, two economists worth reading, always, no matter how mistaken they are Gary Becker and Mark Brown. But both of them hold a thesis that education is almost bound to be investment, which I think our speaker tonight is going to refute. And with that, I hand it over to Stephen.
Yes, I'm not talking about human capital in general. I am just talking about how it relates to education, in particular further education. And the thing is that because the right and the left differ on all sorts of things, but they seem to be united on this, that education, and the more the better, it seems to be the case here, is the key to the knowledge-based economies of the future. There was a report to the British Parliament, the Deering report, I believe, and the quote which I'd like you to hear is, "Learning is the key to prosperity. Investment in human capital will be the foundation of success in the 21st century." And there's hardly a dissenter, really, to this in the Western world. If we look at Europe or North America, Australia, Japan, the trend is towards more and more education. The expenditure on it is increasing. The number of teachers are growing. And in many countries, the percentage of students who enjoy the benefits of college education in a particular age group exceeds 50% of that particular age group. The UK, like Japan, had once a highly selective system governing entrance to university. And now it sends about a third of 18-year-olds to college, I believe. And even the indomitable Swiss, I gather, have finally cracked. And they had a strong tradition of apprenticeship, but now they too are sending more and more youngsters to university. And around about 2005, and most of my figures in this talk will date from the first 5 years of the 21st century, that 15% of school leavers were registered for university attendance, which was double the level of 5 years previously. I actually had a debate, just to show you that it goes across the political spectrum. I had a debate over the internet with Patrick Minford, who was a pretty, regarded as being a sort of right-wing economist. And he mentioned something about this, we need the students for the future economy. And I criticised him. And actually, for ages and ages, he didn't even see the point. I don't think it was me being obtuse or unclear. He just thought it was such a given that we had to have students to produce a successful economy, and the more the better. Eventually, we came round and did have a discussion about it. But, it was just accepted by him. And I felt a bit lonely, really, with these views. I think David shared them to some extent. I remember having a debate with him about them. And then this book came out. Now, unfortunately, it's a bit battered now, and the title is gone, but if you could read it, it would say, "Does Education Matter?" And it's about the myths about education and economic growth. And it's by Alison Wolfe, Professor Wolfe, who's the head of education at the University of London. And she's written quite a good book, questioning a lot of the stuff about human capital and all sorts of other things about education. Actually, the human capital, I did write to her, and she said that everybody was commenting on the human capital aspects and her criticisms of the more education, better economic growth arguments. And she wished to look at the other stuff as well. But anyway, this is what I'm going to talk about tonight. I think it's far and away the most important. We should be clear what the argument here is. The more educated will tend to earn more than their less educated compatriots. There's no doubt about that. And the economists have then gone on to correlate extra years at college with increments in income. And Professor Wolf, she says, she wants to question whether it was the time at college which made these high-earning people skilled. And she also questions whether if you had more people going to college, they would all then go on to become high earners, and whether further additions to time at college will automatically lead to extra GDP. And she even puts under the microscope the idea that education and economic success will be closely linked in the 21st century. And she just put forward the possibility that we might have an overeducated workforce, which is also quite interesting. Anyway, there's no doubt that in the modern world, if you've got the right qualifications in the right subjects from the right universities, then that's important. Whichever country you look at, then you'll find that the educated people earn more. But the point is, if an employer hires graduates, might they just be not looking to see what skills they've gained, but just looking for a method of ascertaining ability of a particular candidate? Wolf says this is in fact the case, that education has become a socially acceptable method of ranking people. The better educated on the whole will be smarter and work harder. And if you hire them with credentials, then it's easy, it's convenient, it's legal, and it's not going to lead you into trouble. And the point being that the billions of public money poured into education may have just resulted in a rather expensive method of job filtering. See, education can be correlated to general intelligence. It can be correlated to motivation, perseverance, even organisational abilities. And these are all desirable qualities for an employer. And if you can get all these qualities in a package, which is, say, a degree or an American high school diploma, then the employer is going to be happy. Wolf says that suppose that everyone left school for good at the age of 15 or even 12, instead of the modern habit of staying on longer and longer. Suppose too that before leaving, everyone took some exams which provided a clear ranking of population. How much less productive would the economy and most of these people then be? I mean, I would think that actually it might well be the economy might function more effectively, and that the billions which are spent on education could be returned to people and used more efficiently. You know, if you just set somebody an IQ test at the age of 15 or 16, and that would be as good a method as any of establishing how useful they're going to be economically. The economists, when they try to calculate the economic benefits from education, they have a number of concepts. The first one of them is the private rate of return for education. And this calculates the income that people get from education after you allow for their direct expense in education and any income that they might have forgone while they were at college. And this involves thinking of education spending as an investment and calculating what percentage return an individual gets for his or her education. And then they have the private returns, and then they have the social returns, which looks at how much a society is spending on students and the benefits which then accrue to society as a whole. I mean, this is more complicated, more tricky to work out, but they are quite happy to do that. And you know, I find lots of the stuff here a bit tricky and spurious, to be honest. But most economists agree that the returns from the private returns are very high, and the social returns are even positive. The Deering Committee, which I mentioned before, into higher education, maintained that since the late 1960s, the long-run social return to higher education has run at 7 to 9% a year. See, I think there's a sort of spurious objectivity here. You know, you can get lifetime incomes and link these to years at school, and then you can compute the cost of schooling in terms of private and public expenditures. And then you know, so you can even compare the returns against the returns from non-human capital. But to establish the cause and effect relationship is trickier. You know, there's a close correlation between intelligence and years of schooling, and another correlation between wealth of parents and length of schooling. And in order to be effective, you know, you're going to have to strip out this sort of thing, try to calculate which causes are relevant here. You know, it could well be that you know, you stay at school for longer and then you earn more, but that might be because you're obviously more intelligent or more energetic or whatever. But they just assume you stay longer at school, and therefore that's the cause behind the higher income. And a lot of the work, another point here, a lot of the work has been done around about in the 1970s. And in Britain at that time, you had people, you know, 5 to 10% of students were going to university at the time I went to university. And you had a quite rigorous examination system which sent these people to university. Now, the obvious point to make is that even if these people hadn't gone to university, wouldn't they have been more economically successful than the average Joe in the street? You know, they had the ability to go to university, pass these exams, study, do work within a certain time frame, which is a commercially desirable attribute. And then to extrapolate from the success of this group, to assume therefore that you extend education more and more, that you'll get the same results, because there's a big jump, and I'll say more about that as we go on. There are also other problems with income calculations, which Professor Wolf mentions, and these can be misleading on the relationship between education and economic growth. See, an important condition for economic prosperity is obviously a legal system which enforces contracts. And if you have a legal system, you've got to have lawyers. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not fond of them particularly, I don't know many people who are, but you've got to have them. And, but you've got to be a bit wary about linking lawyers' salaries too closely to, with economic growth. You know, the number of lawyers and the salaries they get might have something to do with the volume of law and regulation in a particular society. To assume that because lawyers are well paid, is to send even more and more people to law school to improve growth. You can get funny results from that, obviously. I watched the Max Kaiser program on Russia Today now and then. It's quite amusing, and I can recommend it. And he pointed out that a similar sort of quirk in GDP stats, that now in the US, that the prison system costs about $600 billion a year. It's bigger than Medicare or Medicaid, and becoming a huge facet of the American economy, you know. But of course, anybody can see it, and he sees, of course, that you expand it more and more and more, and put everybody in prison. It's not necessarily going to be, a successful procedure for growing the American economy, you know. And that's the sort of thing you get with these stats. I mean, there was UNESCO. I had a quote of Alison Wolf quote from UNESCO, and she talks about a close relationship between educational planning, this is UNESCO in '72, and national overall plans for economic and social development. And of course, the result of this sort of thinking was you've got a plethora of expensively educated bureaucrats and planners and low growth rates. But if you were to follow the rate of return analysis for these people who'd all been sent to university at great expense and then got good jobs. You know, it looks like you're doing the clever thing there. But of course, if you're a peasant farmer, the more and more people, bureaucrats, having to be paid for is not a good thing, and it's not going to mean more growth, it's going to mean less growth. And Alison Wolfe, she says at one point, she's discussing the benefits from expanding the number of lawyers and bureaucrats and people like that. She says, on the contrary, it's no more self-evident that since some education makes some of us rich, more would make more of us richer than it is that 2 aspirin good means 5 aspirin better. It's quite neat. Also, there's lots of things which the human capital people come up with, and they look at cross-country comparisons, for instance. And this again is very inconclusive. One of the examples in Wolf's book, it was in 1980, Egypt was the 47th poorest country in the world in terms of per capita GDP. And 15 years later, it was the 48th poorest, though in the meantime, the educational sector had expanded considerably. South Korea, in that same period, had also expanded its economy somewhat, and sent more and more of its people to university, so that in fact by the mid-90s it had a higher proportion there. And you know, the one case where South Korea enjoyed high economic growth and increased the educational sector, and you had a place like Egypt, which had a poor economic growth and also expanded the education sector somewhat. But of course they always use South Korea as the example when they want to make the case for more spending on education. There are places like Hong Kong and Singapore, and I already mentioned Switzerland, which have a relatively small, by international standards, education sector. And of course they've done very well over the last 50 years in economic growth. My feeling is that the evidence of the different countries around the world tends to show that it's economic growth which more often than not results in education, rather than education causing economic growth. And to put it in the economic terms, I think education is basically a consumption good and not a capital good, as the people like Becker think. There are 2 American economists called Mark Bills and Peter Klenow, and they tried to test out the Becker idea. And you know, they tested out the idea that education increases productivity and therefore the educators will have higher wages. And it's the case that as the workers become more experienced, this is just generally, and build up skills, they'll earn more. And this is called the experience premium. And Bills and Klenow, they pointed out that if the additional education has improved productivity in the short term, so that the workers have less to learn when they start work, and in the long term the workers learn faster and more effectively, then wage statistics should register this fact. We should expect the experience premium to decline over time, and highly educated young workers should get paid more on entry to a job than previous generations did, but accumulate less of an experience premium because they have less to learn. And moreover, those countries with the most rapidly narrowing premiums should grow the fastest as they benefit from the increasing number of well-educated young workers. Well, Bills and Klenow tried to test this, and they just didn't detect any trend at all. And the size of the experience premium seemed to bear little relationship to the growth rates of different countries. And all they could detect was the phenomenon of the fast-growing economy generating further schooling. And I think this is, you know, I think that it's the education which is providing the certificates, the ranking, which is the critical point, and not that you're learning particular skills which you can then go on to use in your job. One of the things that Wolf does is to look at this problem also from the structure, the occupational structure of the economy, rather than looking at it from the point of view of the individual worker. And I mean, there's a lot of this blabber which you get all the time, and shots. I mean, I watched Sky News review of the papers recently, and you had George Galloway, who wasn't too bad actually, and somebody else on with them, and they he came out with this flip line, which you hear a lot, that the costs of education are huge, but the costs of ignorance are far greater. You know, that sort of...
he knows.
That's...
He should know.
That's a typical thing. And you get lots of these sort of remarks, and...
the horse's mouth.
You can... you know, we used to hear talk about the knowledge economy. You know, the Western economies have moved from manufacturing goods to manufacturing ideas. That was one of the flip remarks that they used to make, this turgid jargon. But of course now, after the crash, that's all gone. And now they're having to decide, well, we better manufacture goods after all if we can find anybody to to do it, you know. But what you're looking at really is the occupational structure of the new economies in the 21st century as they saw it. And of course they're right, obviously in some sense, that the coal miners, jobs like coal mining have all but disappeared across most of the Western world. But they're quite wrong in assuming that all the new jobs are going to require high degrees of skill, which you can only learn in the university. And low-skilled jobs still exist by the million. They're going to carry on existing, in my view. Two of the fastest growing sectors of the last decade were care assistants in nursing homes and hospitals and answering the phone in call centres. I mean, those are two of the big expansion areas of the last decade. And it's obvious that as long as we live in houses and apartments and we travel to work and shop in supermarkets, there are going to be jobs for people to clean offices and operate the supermarkets, check outs, stack the shelves, deliver boxes, you know, and do the plumbing and sort out the boiler and stuff like that. And fix the car, of course. All the sort of jobs which people who go to university will come out and think, well, I didn't go to university to do that sort of job. And believe it or not, they don't. So we're having at the moment to import them in from Poland and Eastern Europe, as everybody knows. See, there are many reasons why you might benefit from becoming acquainted with the novels of the Bronte sisters, or starting a course in the Italian language. But it's nothing to do with education for growth. You know, these are because these are things that might interest you and make you amuse you or make you a better person or something like that. Wolf says, I find it difficult to construct a convincing argument that more degrees are needed so that people will be educated enough to stack shelves, swipe credit cards, or operate a cappuccino machine effectively. And she thinks that it's over-education that's the norm in the Western world, and that people are acquiring lots of skills which they're not going to be using. Some economists have even pointed out that lots of jobs which are the same as they were 30 years ago are asking now that candidates should have a degree, whereas 30 years ago they would have asked that they just had the A-levels, the qualifications which people got when leaving school at 18. And I just see that education is becoming like, it's becoming a race where everybody is running longer and longer. But it's still true that only 10% of people can still finish in the top 10%, unfortunately. She goes into other things, by the way, which I just mentioned in passing in here very briefly. I mean, I think her views on the human capital debate are the most interesting, but she also she laments the fact that the increase in student numbers has reduced the average quality of university education and produced this famous dumbing down effect, which is one of the topics of conversation. But I don't see how you can not have that. You know, if you're sending more and more students to university, the courses are going to have to be very palatable and passable for the majority of the students. They're not going to all go to university and be failed. I mean, in any case, 20%, I gather, of people who go to university drop out after the first year in any case. So if you make it harder, it's going to become quite ridiculous. She also is sad that there's a financial stringency. And she was writing this book, by the way, just when the Blair government brought in the first tuition fees, which were about $3,000 a year. So we hadn't actually had the full effect of and we don't know quite what the effect of paying out $9,000 a year or $6,000. I think $9,000 is quite common. She laments the fact that students now have to pay for all this. But again, I have not much sympathy there. You know, the main sufferers from the expansion of education over the last 50 years are located outside, not inside the education centre. Peter Bauer said that foreign aid was the transfer of resources from the poor of the first world to the rich of the third world. Well, I think the education system was a transfer of resources from the poor of the first world to the rich of the first world, on the whole. That's Wolf. There are one or two other people who have been critical of it. Another person is Ruth Lee, who's quite a decent economist. She worked for the Institute of Directors, I believe. And she wrote an interesting article around about the time this book came out. And I'll just briefly summarise it. She just looks at the point of view, not really the human capital aspect, but does it make, for whatever reason, whether they're using it as a ranking system or passing on skills, does it make economic sense to do a degree? And this is around about 2004, when we just had as I said again, we just had the first dose of tuition fees. And she quoted the Department for Education and Science saying that the premium, what you gain from over a lifetime from going to university was £400,000. This is what the Department for Education and Science thought. And she criticises their figures on the grounds that they didn't split us up into degree class or subject and various other reasons. And she said there'd been a more recent study from Swansea University in which they thought the premium was only $150,000 that you gained over a lifetime, making the allowances for the time you spent at university, such things, over a school leaver with 2 or more A-levels. And she then decided that maths and engineering and medicine, according to the study, were all positive for earnings. But even at this day, 2014, arts degrees, this study decided, arts degrees for men, they tend to exclude women from that, because obviously a lot of women will not go into work or stay in work over a lifetime. So arts degrees for men, the return was actually negative even then. You know, the graduates were leaving with average debts of £20,000. So if you're going to do an arts degree just for purely economic reasons, it wouldn't make sense. And of course, if you're going to pay triple what you were paying then, triple the 3,000, which you don't pay until you get lots of money.
Inflation is very useful.
Okay, we'll come to that sort of argument later. But they were saying that you'd lose out. So, you know, just thinking that going to the right college and going to the studying the right subject would be the thing to do. I must just, I'll just finish by saying that I actually came across, I used to think that it was obviously beneficial. I was a bit like Minford. And the first doubt came into me, just as a little illustration. When I did a degree in history, and I somehow got into programming computers, which is a long story, so I'm not going to bore you, but that's how it is. And of course, most of the people in computers are from a scientific background, one way or another. I did meet one programmer who had done a music degree, but the vast majority were from mathematics or physics or chemistry, something like that. And I was working with a guy who I knew had done a degree in mathematics. And I said to him, this is a long time ago now, I said to him at one point, I don't know why, I said, well, at least you did a subject which is relevant to your job now. And he turned to me and he said, no, he said, it's not relevant. He said, I did a bit of Fortran programming when I was a mathematician, but the overwhelming majority of stuff I did hadn't had the slightest relevance to my job as a programmer. And when he was saying this, I suddenly realised I said something pretty stupid. And, you know, it was getting pretty obvious. And it was at that point that I realised that the vast majority of degrees are going to have next to no relevance to the job that people do in later life. And even the jobs which are superficially relevant, well, are relevant, like medicine or law.
Yeah.
And teaching, of course, is an example of not being at all relevant, the subject. You know, teachers are basically people who run daycare centres for children as they grow older, and that should be obvious to you as you are a teacher.
And pedophiles.
But
Part your wages.
no, at that point I realised this, and that even for the people who do, and this, you know, someone who obviously went and did a degree in computer science is not doing something totally relevant to what they're doing, but most of the stuff that they're going to learn on the job. Anyway, let's hear the country case to this.
Yes. Is there anyone? John?
Yeah.
Yes. John?
Yeah. Unless I missed it in the first few minutes, Steve, I'm sorry about that. I didn't notice you making a clear distinction between training and education. And because of the current egalitarian filth, they completely muddle these two things together. They call it all education, whilst education, from the root educare, meaning to draw out and, you know, develop you as a person. That's what the very word means. While training is simply teaching you something useful. And if you take this distinction seriously, then we have to see that, for instance, plumbers and doctors and lawyers have merely been trained, which is why if you have a conversation with a lawyer, you're not really talking to an educated man. He hasn't been educated past A-level.
David. There is.
So, and once you make this distinction clearly, and it isn't merely elitist or snobbish, then you see that one thing is inherently financially useful, and that's training, And the other one is a consumer good, and that's education. Education is a consumer good, training isn't, but you must make a clear distinction between the two. My niece used to often, as one of her things, every time I went for Sunday lunch with my parents and met my niece, one of my nieces, she would get me to explain what philosophy was to her. And eventually she'd have to stop because she was laughing so much that it was painful. She went on to do business studies. I'm sure she's very happy, but the world of the intellect is nothing to her whatsoever. So introduce this distinction. If we were to go back, if the government were to go back to the system of polytechnics, where you're actually teaching people technical skills, it would be a bit clearer. But of course, amongst those technical skills, we also have to have the so-called professions, which are no more than technical skills. Well, I'll draw a line under it there and leave it to you to comment.
Well, I don't, you know, I think lots of courses which would go under training have also got nothing to do with your ability to do further jobs. I did a course once when I was studying computing, and part of it was business, well, it was like called business studies or management or something like that. And of course, we've all read some sociology books and tried to plough through the space of mumbo jumbo as they come up with it. But the stuff in business studies was even worse. You know, it was just the most dreadful, turgid stuff, and absolutely nothing at all to do with business and how you would run an office or a firm. You know, so lots of stuff which is training is not.
It's not even training.
It's not even training.
Lower education.
I mean, we could just say courses which people go to at the age of 18, which might be called education or might be called training, whatever they call them. They're not much bloody use.
Certification.
When they want to go. So
certification.
Oh, and just as a final point, my understanding is correct that educare, E-D-U-C-E-R-E, does mean to lead out. Latin. There's also a Latin verb, educare, E-D-U-C-A-R-E, educare, from which I believe our word education is derived, and that word means to nourish. So the Romans, at least for what it's worth, didn't think it was anything to do with drawing something out of people, but putting something in. But that's an aside.
Yes, they are. I agree with all what you said, and I never went to university, and my probably highest degree is a driving license. And but I was in business, and I ran a company and things like this. You learn a lot on the job, and a lot of things that you do is actually managing people, dealing with people, things like this. The technical skills are, in most cases, except in very specialized areas, irrelevant to the business. But then, if you look at these very technical skills that you learn either at Polytechnic or used to learn at Polytechnic, or training or engineering schools, medicine and so on, are subsidies we give businesses. So in other words, if a company that recruits engineers to do something that is very specialized is recruiting them from the state system is effectively subsidized that company which would have otherwise to train these people itself. So it's not a subsidy necessarily from the poor to the rich, it's a subsidy from society to big companies.
Well, Well, okay, I mean, it's coming from, I think, it used to be the case that it came from most people who didn't go to university, and subsidised people who did go to university. You know, the firm pays lots and lots of taxes itself. If it didn't pay taxes to get these people, he would do it. He would do it. And we're looking at trying to calculate who's gaining out of this. It'd be a bit tricky, wouldn't it?
I think usually people with jobs in education. That's who's gaining. They're the people who are being subsidised.
Well, even so, and but
lots of you gave an example of someone who was gaining a skill, going into a firm, fine, and there are obviously cases that someone who goes, one of the people who goes on to become a translator, say, for a book, would gain from studying that language at university, but vast numbers of students will, and I was just one of them, and we'll have plenty more of them here, will have gone to further education and done nothing at all of relevance to their future vocation or jobs.
you learn to become a good citizen. That is the idea. I mean, behind education and so on. So that's.
I tend to think that's it. I tend to think that's the opposite of what actually happens at university. That it plants all sorts of daft ideas in your head about society, and you learn to become a bad citizen to some extent, and then you're a good citizen before you went to university. You learn silly ideas, and then you leave university and become a good citizen again.
It's a component of Tottenham riots, isn't it, in education?
Yeah, I would actually question if our education system, our university system, is at all made to really educate people to be productive. I think it is more, I mean, every political system has to find a method to deal with intellectuals, to somehow get them into the system. And since democracies cannot, kill them all and drive them out, as dictatorships would do, they have developed a system to integrate them, because, I mean, the state has a lot of control over universities. And if you look, a lot of people who come out of this system basically are later employed by the state with good salaries, but basically are not working productively in the economy, besides from a few degrees at side. But I think this whole education system that we have is not really. It is wrong to look at it as a system to make people more productive. It is a system to integrate opposition into the system. That's the main purpose of it, and therefore as such it works very well, I think.
I hadn't really thought about that, Nico. But I mean, I'm just dealing with the question as to what they claim. This is the justification, one of the major justifications behind the expansion in the education system, tertiary education system across the Western world. And they say that it's economically going to be a good thing. And that's actually what they claim. So I was just dealing with that. I mean, and then if I were to put these arguments to these people, they'll say, oh, there's some truth in that. But don't forget, it's also to make you a good citizen.
Oh, the arts.
To study the Bronze Sisters or the Italian Renaissance.
You studied me.
Or when you tell them,
or whatever.
Or when you tell them in Peter Bowers international aid is no good. Say, oh yeah, we know it's no good, but you've got to have a heart and give them the money anyway. That's sort of. And
on this business about universities controlling to keep the intellectual, I don't know about that. I mean, look, Nico, I think it's just a part of the general expansion of the state. Before the First World War in the UK, all the universities were privately financed. They had patronage and donations, and they were obviously the sector was small, but not negligible. And it was expanding all through the late Victorian period, and they had donations and stocks and shares and the whole business. And then they all went into the First World War, stock markets collapsed, the whole caboodle. And they came out of the First World War in Britain, and they were broke. And they went to the government and said, well, we're broke, we want some money from you. And that's how it started. That's how the state involvement in the tertiary sector in this country started.
Well, I think it could be argued that it's not university education, it's not even a consumption good. Time at university can be great fun. Time. That's because you're a teenager or early 20s and drinking a lot, shagging around, meeting people, all sorts of people who are your own age, your own sort of bent, some of them. More so than in the general world, the world outside university, so it's wonderful for those who like that kind of thing. And you have to go to the lectures, whatever, that's not much fun, admittedly, but the rest of it is quite good fun. So it's not even a consumption good, except the time you spend. But if you were to look at the time you spend, and the time you spend between being 15 and 25, is a time in which you were, I should hope, you became more knowledgeable, more adept at certain things. That's just part of growing up. So I would go further and say, if it were made illegal and rigorously enforced, to have no university, no higher education, you could read books, go on the internet, and there could be household groups assembling, no profits allowed, no wages being paid, to study together and argue together. How much difference would it really make?
It was
what people knew, how much people would know and learn.
well, not very much, but I mean, the great thing from my point of view, when I went to university was, it kept me away from the world of work. You know, the whole idea of work terrified me. And that was one of the big incentives behind doing reasonably well at school and then going on to university. And when I came to the end of university, like a lot of students, I think, you know, it wasn't a case of, oh, now I'm really tooled up and I get a good job, you know. It was, oh my God, what am I going to do now?
John? When it comes to schooling, if you want your children to be as educated as possible, then obviously you've got to go in for something like home education. But if it goes past what you're able to do, tutors are the thing. If you want your children to really excel, then you get some tutors. Now, tutors don't need to cost that much. It won't cost anything like as much as it does to send a child to a public school. So the question arises, why do people send children to public schools? It isn't actually for the education at all. It's so you become part of the old boy network and part of the hierarchy. You meet people there, that you stay, and you know them, and you've got contacts.
And CV.
Well, no, I think the main reason is the one I gave.
Also to kick them out of the house.
Daycare centre. No, I see about that. The daycare centre, so that if the parents go to work, then they have someone to look after the child. And the other reason, of course, even if they don't go to her, or one of them goes to work, she gets a bit of peace and quiet.
It's certainly true to say in the Ivy League system in America, part of the payback for paying so much to get there is that you know the people who know the people. The people are going to be part of the establishment. It is handy. Oh, it's very. And also, referring back to your earlier point about the earnings of those in university, how many of those go to legal monopolies, medical monopolies, state employment? If you stripped out all of those wages,
it's true, but
what would it appear to pay?
You might see the path through universities leading to one of the privileged monopolies.
I believe in America, most of the increased spending on education is actually spending on schools, sports teams, teachers' salaries, teachers' pensions, periods off sick by teachers, and associated teaching staff.
In some states, teachers' salaries are ridiculous.
By the way, I just spent. You need a minute, yeah. I'll just mention this. I forgot to mention it actually at the end. David sent me this, and he sent me this. It was quotes Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics, and I must try and get hold of the book. And he has a section on human capital, evidently. and Saul says, while human capital can take many forms, there is a tendency of some to equate it with formal education. However, not only may many other valuable forms of human capital be overlooked in this way, the value of formal schooling may be exaggerated, and its counterproductive consequences in some cases not understood. The Industrial Revolution was not created by highly educated people, but by people with practical industrial experience, and David mentioned George Stephenson. He was the guy who was the steam engine.
Yeah, the
steam engine, and evidently Saul mentions that the Wright brothers never went to college, and Thomas Edison had only about 3 months of formal schooling.
Yeah.
I completely accept what you said about a lot of training being pretty useless and what some people would now call certification. In the guise of training, you've got to fill the course with something, so they put various things in, and they're in there for all sorts of reasons, politically correct and just to hand it out, whatever. But there is a real distinction between education and training, and when I try to explain philosophy to a couple of people a year or two ago, and I just couldn't get it through to them. They just said, it's just all bullshit. I just can't understand why you think this is education. And so I said, look, it works like this, really. So if you want to understand the distinction, you can easily imagine a trained dog. It would stand on its hind legs, jump through hoops of fire or whatever. So that would be quite remarkable and clever. So what you can't imagine is an educated dog. That would be a miracle. So that's the difference between education and training.
A dogmatic point.
I'm not averse to this distinction that you make. It's not particularly relevant to anything I've said, but fine.
Richard?
Actually, I wasn't sure if I was going to agree with this to start with, but I don't see why an education at university has to take 3 years. When I was a student, we only had to do 8 hours a week of lectures and tutorials. And when I was there, I thought, is that it? You could do the whole thing could be done in 1 year, not 3, really. And when I did graduate, the excuse I heard more often than anything else for not giving me a job was that I was overqualified. So ignoring it. Oh, we only promote people who are the manager's mates. I would rather swap the degree for my dad being chairman of the stockbroker or something like that. Yeah, you're right.
I mean, one thing I remember from university was that the arts subjects, in terms of going into college, were much easier than the science subjects. I shared a student house with someone who was studying geology and some other subjects. And they had to get up every morning and go to the lab, do 3 hours. And in the afternoon, it was like a job, you know. And I saw this about. And I was doing history. And, you know, we had maybe half a dozen lectures in a week, if they weren't cancelled, because something. And so I don't know, I think they just have it as 3 years, because some courses would take 3 years. Because maybe like physics or chemistry.
It's 3.5, isn't it?
Which are fully, you know, and the time is pretty fully utilised. So they think, oh, well, we better make the arts courses 3 years as well, you know.
The one private university we have in this country, the University of Buckingham, of course, does do their degrees in 2 years. Now, if you can get it from 3 years down to 2 years with one university competing with about 100 others, you know, I think you could easily get it down to a year with a bit more competition introduced into the system. That is scrapping the state involvement altogether.
Of course, when it comes to the point where people are paying for the courses, this time differential is going to become important, so the shorter the course, the better. I can't, Nico might be able to tell me, but I lived in Germany for a while. I got the impression that courses took 4 years there, and there were lots of postgraduate students who I knew who'd been doing PhDs for about 10 years from now.
Oh, usually 15, 20 years.
And I was amazed by this at the time. But there we go.
No, courses in Germany, the traditional German system was 4 to 5 year normally, but only like 10% made it in that time. So normally you would study for 7, 8 years. And you have lots of students in the late 20s, early 30s, just about finishing their first degree. That's how it works.
I think if we had proper competition, they'd scrap any idea that it should take any amount of time, and they'd simply say, okay, you can simply sit your finals now if you think you're ready for it.
Good point.
Now, Ruth Lawrence, when she went to university, I think at the age of 10, to do maths, she was forced to twiddle her thumbs for about 3 years. She then was allowed to sit her finals. She walked out after about an hour, having answered all of the questions. And she got enough marks to get the equivalent of 3 firsts. Basically, they wasted 3 years of her life by making her. Of course, all the other students hated her, but they hadn't been hothoused as she had been.
Well, I think she's right too.
So there would definitely be with competition between the systems. You could go straight. You could go straight for the final exam. Oh, a similar example of this was the. You must have seen the film Catch Me If You Can, where he does a famous impersonates pilots and counterfeits money and whatever. One of the things, and this is apparently true, is he sits and passes his bar finals in a matter of weeks, and the detective who eventually catches him says, I just can't understand how you sort of hack the computer to fiddle this. He said, no, he said, I just read the books and sat the exams in 6 weeks and passed. It really isn't that difficult.
But I think the reason why he's going to keep it 3 years is because of Bob's network. You do meet the people who you know the rest of your life. I mean, look at how many people from Warwick University around here. But you do. It's now a meeting place of where young people are.
That's another problem with it. Yes.
But there will be other ways.
When I went to university, it reminded me of Buckley's that I've been to a few years earlier, except that it had a library on the periphery of the campus.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Well, I'll have a little comeback about school. I didn't spend that time learning. About half the time I was teaching people who were interested in what I wanted to teach, wanted to learn, and that's why we spent our time. We were very, very enthusiastic about mathematics. That was true when I went to independence.
Yes, I think that there are schools which are academically oriented. And you went to, I think you taught in a private school. And perhaps there's some state schools like that where there is definitely some
7%.
Academic. But the vast majority of children, and this is why it's so absurd to say Miliband's idea is only 60%. They're not academic orientated particularly. And there's nothing against them. It's just that they're not academically orientated. So why send them on this little course, which is not relevant to their lives?
You speak up, Jeremy.
And yes, I agree plainly. There are people who are talented, say, at mathematics, and like Ruth Lawrence, and obviously would learn a lot at school, and people who are good at music who learn. But for the vast majority of pupils who are not academically oriented, I still think, and of course, no doubt they do pick up things at school. I'm not going to deny that either. That schools basically function as daycare centres. That's why, by the way, there was a book which came out about 1970. It was part of this counterculture movement by Ivan Illich, and who was a
Deschooling Society.
Deschooling Society. He was a Catholic theologian, but he came along, and he went into schools, and he saw what, really, you can all see, that lots of what goes on in schools has nothing at all to do with learning. People marching around, going to things, kept in order, and he then comes to the conclusion that schools are, are sources of oppression, and we have to de-school society. And of course, he saw a lot of it, but I still think he's wrong, because he thought that schools were for education, you see. That was his mistake. And then when he discovered that they weren't, he thought there was some sort of terrible thing going on. But of course they're not for education, they're daycare centres. And in Victorian time, remember, in Britain, schools were private until about 1870. And they were growing rapidly, and parents were voluntarily sending their children to schools in Britain without the state intervening. So showing that there really was a demand for schools. But as I said, for the main reason being for daycare centres.
Well, also that parents couldn't read, and they thought if my kids could read, they can get a better job.
You sometimes see these stories about in America, or even in London now, I guess, where they go, children goes into schools and they search for bloody knives and weapons and things like that. Well,
it's okay if the knives aren't bloody, but those bloody knives.
People have completely lost the point of schools there, because they are daycare centres, so the parents are sending their children from one area, the home where their relatives are safe, into a daycare centre where they're less safe. It's missing the point because they're not being cared for.
I went to a secondary modern school, and I always used to think on the way home, it's a good job no one at home asked me what I'm going to learn today, because I'll have to say nothing. In secondary modern schools, you learn nothing. And I remember a school teacher at the age of 13 giving me a lecture, saying, you lot, she was addressing the whole class, she says, you lot have got the world at your fingertips here, you can learn a hell of a lot of this. I hope I'll never forget this. She's a very beautiful young lady of about 23. I hope I'll never forget that what she's telling me is downright bloody nonsense. There's no opportunity here whatsoever to learn. I hope I'll never forget it. I hope I'm not one of the others who, passing you out of it, you say bygones are bygones and say, yes, it was okay after all. Because this is not okay, and I hope, and of course I never did forget it, and throughout the rest of my life I'm advocating the Ivan Illich, the de-schooling thing, and the homeschooling and summer hill and that sort of stuff. Yes, John?
Yeah. This makes me realise, actually, insofar as I have any intellectual abilities whatsoever, why I have them. It definitely had nothing to do with Sludge-Mouth Comprehensive, where I went to. It was my father's bookshelves. On my father's bookshelves, I read De-Schooling Society, virtually everything Isink ever wrote, Alvin Toffler's Future. My father used to read these books. I used to sit and watch him reading these books. Why is he reading those books? That must be interesting, it must be important. So after he'd finished with them, I'd get them and I'd read them, and some of it would sink in. And that's actually what made me have some sort of an intellect. It had absolutely nothing to do with my school whatsoever.
I mean, to be fair, I'll side with Jeremy a bit here. Yes, I think that's most children's experience, but it's possible, you must admit that, it is possible that something that happens at school,
you went to a grammar school,
something that happens at school could stimulate you. For instance, there was one teacher who taught history, and this is why I studied the damn thing, and he was actually interested in the subject. Now that itself is rare, that you have a teacher which is interested in the subject that they teach. They don't tell you that. They don't tell you that on the news. But that is a rarity. And he had all sorts of ideas, many which I suspect were completely wrong. For instance, he talked about the Great Depression. He said, we had the Great Depression, but we had Keynes. Here's his story, right? He said he sorted that out now. And I went, oh, has he really? But at least he'd heard of Keynes and read of him. And he had another idea which I was under the thrall of for a long time, and that was that wars never inaugurate changes, but merely accelerate existing changes.
That's a good thesis.
And that was interesting to me. And the guy had obviously thought, you know. Now, I'm not, I think he was, like I think the First World War, in fact, did inaugurate dreadful changes. So I think he's wrong on that.
Yes, he's wrong.
But the point was, the guy had thought about it. So school can produce people, but it's rare, I agree, it's rare.
Yeah. A lucky teacher.
Yeah, well, I think it is more. I agree, it can happen, but more often the exact opposite happens.
Yes.
That people are actually put off of learning. I know from my experience, when I had finally some holidays from school, I could finally learn stuff that I wanted to learn and wasn't because I had some free time, and I was looked by other pupils a little bit strange that I was reading some books that in my holidays, because this was supposed to be free time. So that schools systematically educate you that learning something is work that is something you have to do, but it's not fun, and that is kind of sad, because then they are not able to really learn the stuff that they actually need to learn in their lives.
Also, it educates you that learning is for children and not for adults. I can remember not wanting to learn anything about mathematics because I was too old. And that was when I was about 15. And so I come up with this statement that compulsory education was like an inoculation against further learning in adult life.
Didn't work in your case, David. We've all heard of the Labour theory of value, but now we have the expenditure theory of value. And the more that the government spends upon education, the more education there is. Is this true? Apart from the fact, no. Elaborate.
Well, I would elaborate if I knew quite what the question entailed. I mean, if we're talking about what I was talking about, that we're getting more and more returns in the sense of human capital, then I think they're now looking at these figures that they're getting, and they're finding that, you know, whereas somebody in 1970 who went on to university earned, you know, £400,000 or more over a lifetime, but now it's getting smaller and smaller, and as I mentioned at the end of the talk, it's in some cases becoming negative.
But even in that case, as you have said, that's simply because they were in the top 8, 7, 10%.
Yes.
And without going to university, they were in the top 8,
Yeah, I think that's the whole point of it.
And would have earned as much.
I haven't yet seen any evidence that they even thought about that such an obvious point.
Have you read the work of Brian Kaplan? Who goes in for a lot of this?
I haven't read Kaplan, but I have read a book on the whole human capital thing by Blau.
You're smart Blau.
And it's, you know, it starts when they were discussing these questions around about 1960. And there were, some economists were quite critical of it. And then along comes Becker, a bit like Keynes, you know, and converts the whole economics profession to it. And I think now they're starting to question a bit more.
I think Kaplan's main point is that it's all nearly signalling. In other words, it's companies don't have to do the sorting out; it's going to be done for them. I mean, they can't stop it. I mean, they're being taxed. These people are being sorted, so they'll make use of the sorting. But they could have sorted it themselves. They could have done it with a 2-hour paper, as the civil service.
Because, as Alison Wolfe said in that quotation, you could do it at the age of 15 by setting them, as they did, by setting them exams at that age, or an IQ test.
Yeah, Kaplan has been debating the whole thing with economic.org.
Have they?
You recommend it?
He doesn't even understand the economic calculation.
No, but he's good at other things.
Yeah, I just say quickly, I mean, my take on this is, yeah, you're right to a large extent. I mean, I've always thought that a lot of it's been absolute nonsense. It's pretty much the same as Keynes' argument of burying money in the ground and sending people out to find it. You know, keep them busy. They're not doing it. They're not robbing banks and they're not causing trouble. And when they find this money, they can spend it. It's going to expand the economy. Exactly the same thing. Keeps people out of trouble. They're enjoying themselves. You know, in social groups, and it expands the economy. creates jobs, puts teachers in work, it puts students out of trouble and enjoying it.
But it doesn't.
Generally, I'm talking about generally.
There speaks an eternal student, by the way. Still a student.
You know, I would make the obvious point that quite often students cause a lot of trouble. You know, we could go back to '68 and the whole
Go back to last weekend.
and we can go back to the
Going back a long,
we can go back to the demonstration
But just
which we had recently.
But that wasn't like most of them. Not today. Students still go to that.
But what about the Tottenham riots?
Well, that wasn't students. That wasn't students. That wasn't any big anyway.
It was anarchists, wasn't it?
That's only
The
one
police.
strike. I mean, I think it was really the police. They caused it, didn't they? They started killing people.
Well, they killed people and they stood by and refused to stop the riots.
Yeah.
But
when you got the person in charge of the police now,
proper excuse for
you
killing.
know, in charge of the Menzies killing. I mean, that's a red rank to a club. Anyway, let me go off the point here. That's the first strand. There's three strands of this. And the second strand is this: that when you mentioned the thing about the Industrial Revolution, how it was started by people who were practical, who weren't very well educated, and what have you, and steam. I mean, it might have been kicked off like that. But if you take the steam engine, a good example of the steam engine, starting on a very practical basis by simple industrialists. All the main engineering on a modern steam engine, what became a modern steam engine, was done here at University College by Trevedic. Trevedic?
He's working in Devon for very well. Oh, here he is.
Most of his work here.
No, he didn't.
No, I don't think so.
Well, he got a big plaque up there.
In Devon.
Oh, they'll claim it if they can, but I don't think he
The
went to
fact is, he's a
university.
very
No.
educated engineer.
He did his work in Devon.
Mathematics and physics and all that. So, I mean, chemistry.
There was a lot of mathematics to it, and he was good at mathematics, but he didn't go to college to study mathematics.
Well, there's been a
He's
way
rejoicing mind the fact is the college students.
Yes, but in Devon, yeah, Cornwall.
But that takes us on to research and what have you. I mean, especially today with modern research and electronics and so forth. I mean, you do need a lot of investments in that to progress in industry and so forth.
Let's find the top lines. Bill,
Then there's
Bill
another.
Laboratories did this for years.
Yep.
But then there's another strand to this. What you touched on
I just wait until you finish.
about lawyers, accountants, a lot to do with medicine as well. This is what I call the magicians, like the magician's wand, where they're not really. What they're doing is selecting people to teach them how to conjecture this and conjecture that, so that other people can't see them, to do tricks. But that's an important thing. I mean, effectively, they're pretty much like a magician. I mean, just to give you a simple example. If you've got shares with or pension with a company, then you might find the bump coming through your letterbox is about an inch thick, with all the statements and the financial forecasts and every other thing that's involved in it. One thing, you find the profiles of the chairman, of the company secretaries, of the board, and what have you. What you won't find in there, no matter how thick it is, it might have some quite thick, 6 inches thick in some cases, A4, you won't find a single sentence telling you how much you are paying all the people with their profiles in there. Not a single statement, believe me. Now when you paid into that fund, they wanted to know how much you were earning, how much tax you were paying, your health, what your liability was, and they want to know every little ins and outs about you. But on the other hand, they don't give you any information whatsoever about themselves, what they're taking out of your fund and paying themselves with. You'll never find that anywhere, and it'd be virtually impossible to get hold of that. That's because they're the magicians who've been told how to weave their way, how to pinch your money off you. And that's like Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, ACCA, Association of Chartered Certified Accountants,
I mean, there's tins and tins of them, and they just tell. It's 14 exams you take to get ACCA qualified, and each one of them tells you, how to trick your way into stealing other people's money. But then once you get that, then that's excluded other people from joining that club. It's a very exclusive club as well. Only about 140, between 140 and 160,000 people in the UK. Not very many.
All right, Stephen did say that wait until you finish. When will you finish?
Let's take these.
That's the magician bit. I'm just saying about 3 strands to this.
Well, let's take the point.
3 strands, another 2 strands.
One by one. Well, first of all,
the magician bit, the research bit.
It was only a third way for the first strand.
The first one was the need to put these bottles in the ground and say, millions of people to find them. I mean, so don't forget, incidentally, these people are not going to pay their money back. They have to earn, every single one of them, over £40,000 when the average, I believe the average salary now is 25. They have to earn over £40,000 in their lifetime to pay that money back.
They'll do that.
So they all know they're not going to pay it back. And by the way, after 30 years, it cuts out anyway. So we're only going to wait for 30 years, and you're not going to.
Only going to wait till you take your final exam back.
So what's the? Anyway,
it's free money from the taxpayer.
Let's just look at some of these points. One was
it's free money from the taxpayer.
One was the point about the engineer who did some design. Trevenick, yeah. Well, you have to be a bit careful here to establish that the stuff that was valuable he learned at university and didn't learn somewhere else or at a firm. I mean, the point is that anybody who's the vast majority of people who are reasonably bright these days will go through university, inevitably, just as they go to school. But you don't say, because he went to such and such a school, therefore we have the school to thank that he designed such and such a bloody computer program or whatever. On the research, well, obviously, lots of companies do research, and a company like Glaxo will do research and employ people to research. I mean, it's crucial that they come up with new drugs. And what's more, the research they do will be much more commercially orientated than the research done by universities. Now, I'm not saying that universities should do commercially orientated research. I'm just saying that there's plenty of good reasons for companies to research. And the final point was the
magician bit, what I call the conjecture. Lawyers, accountants, a lot of people.
A lot of hocus pocus goes into business. Yeah, I agree with that. I'm not going to dispute that, but I don't see that that's a criticism of anything I said, is it?
Pat did have the points that he made at the beginning of his contribution, where he said that in answer to Sobol, he said that was all very well at the beginning, but later on, this is often a point made, now, advanced science and advanced education is needed. Yeah. That's a very common point that's made. Do you want to address that?
Well, I addressed it to some extent when I talked about the mathematician that I got to know, who became a programmer, and he did a degree in mathematics, and he pointed out that it wasn't relevant, and that much of the technical stuff which people do in engineering or programming or the more technical subjects will not be learned at university. And it's certainly not essential that they go to university to learn this stuff. It's like that. And if there were some technical stuff really essential, then you could get sent on a course. I was sent on computer programming courses by an employer.
I think you know what Jan said about bringing back the polytechnics and the definition of university. Is it one truth? You mean one university truth? There's only one truth, and that would be at odds with the whole philosophy of university anyway.
Because the polytechnics used to just teach the Brontes and so on exactly this sort of stuff, and philosophy and stuff. Very, very little, although they were named polytechnics, there's very little technical things. But when I got this insight that me and Steve share was when I went as an apprentice in 1963, and I started thinking myself, 4 days a week, I was thinking, what on earth has he got to do on Fridays, which was the 5th day of the week that I went to college? What has what I got to do on Fridays got to do with this here? the job I'm learning.
That was a bit similar, actually. That was the theory.
Well, perhaps he tried to sympathise me, yes, but he had nothing. What I was learning, what I was learning on the day release had absolutely nothing to do with the other 4 days in work, and that's how I got Stephen's insights.
There's also the idea that at the end of it, you owe the state something. That whole idea as well, where you actually owe them something.
Well, I don't think we can entirely leave out intellectual or human capital. However, sometimes, such as in the late 18th century, we have very primitive steam engines. But they're a lot better than donkeys and horses and wind power. So we have coal used to fuel boilers, which propel beam engines, which drain the mines, which gets you more coal. Now, this worked very well, because the coal could then do, with other engines, a lot of work that men would have to do, donkeys, horses, and wind. And for many years, these very inefficient engines, and of course, they're not getting any more coal out of the ground, they're making more engines, because the price of iron is falling, transportation is taking place. So we mustn't neglect simple things that aren't really much of an intellectual advance at all, but simply capital ploughed back to being more capital. Not necessarily intellectual capital. You mustn't forget that there is non-human capital, which is of no little importance in itself.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, I think Adam Smith's great insight, and it was an insight later on, and Gary Becker's insight, is that human capital is just as good as this other capital, which they thought was obviously good.
But not better, necessarily.
Oh, no, they didn't think it was better.
It's just called capital.
No, Becker has never had the idea that human capital is better than ordinary capital. On the contrary, he has the idea that it's obvious that capital is valuable, and there is human capital that you're likely to overlook. See, that's what Becker's and Smith's idea was. And of course, it does exist. There is human capital. The fact that we can speak English is in fact human capital. Whatever, and the fact that Chinese can speak Chinese, that's human capital. And then you've got the native Chinese thing, which from an economic point of view would be land. And then you've got labour, which of course is obvious, more obvious. So there is land, capital and labour in each human. And this is one of the reasons why Malthus is wrong, because Malthus wants to hold, he wants to add labour, and he wants to hold capital and land constant. But you can't do that, because when you're adding labour, you're adding capital and land. So Malthus doesn't work. Whichever way you cannot possibly get a situation where you hold what Malthus wants to do, land and capitals constant, while you just add labour. There's too much human capital and too much land in the workers. Anyone else want to?
We've been delighted enough.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Stephen. It's been a marvellous talk. It's absolutely right. Becker was a very bright man, and you're back loud, although he's a bright man as well. He's wrong and you're right in my opinion.
My pleasure.